Okay, this is a presentation of Teaching and Researching Listening by Michael Rost. I read the most recent edition, the third edition, which was published in 2016. This was a challenging book to read, but it was also quite informative. I would say that the early parts of the book are a little slow and complex. There's quite a bit of theory involved in the concept of listening. Much of the book lays the groundwork for the theory and then builds on top of that to discuss classroom applications and research applications. And as you can see, the book is broken into 4 sections. First section is defining listening. The second section is teaching listening. The third section is researching listening. And then the final section is exploring listening. And at the back of the book, there's also a glossary of terms, of which there are many, and an index as well. So let's go ahead and get started. The first section, defining listening, this section starts out with some pretty heavy concepts, some scientific theory and linguistic theory, and it starts, as all listening does, with a discussion of sound waves and the ear. So you can go ahead and picture this as you're listening to my voice speaking. The sound is traveling into your ear. And what does it do there? It goes through the ear canal and all the way up into the brain. And your ability to follow what I am saying depends on both your understanding of what I'm saying, the words, the sound waves, the presentation that I am giving, and the knowledge that you have in your head of what a presentation should sound like, and your background knowledge of the theory of listening. So that's a mini overview of the theory that's involved in the bulk of this book. So let's go ahead and look at this book chapter by chapter. So this first chapter includes a discussion of neurological processes such as consciousness and attention, and these are critical components of an individual's ability to pay attention and comprehend various pieces of information while they are listening. And for second language learners, consciousness and attention affect them because they have to interpret what they are hearing, and they have to pay attention, and they have to comprehend. But in a second language, this is often difficult. One small misunderstanding draws their attention away from what the speaker or whatever they are listening to is saying. So, for example, as you're listening to me, if you misunderstand what I'm saying, you still have the ability to pick it back up by using context clues and by using other inferences and using other knowledge in your understanding of English. But for a second language learner, their attention is drawn away, and then they have to do memory repair and try to figure out how to gain their bearings again. Once again, while they are listening. Then chapter 2 is about linguistic processing. It's about perceiving speech. And a lot of this chapter reminded me of the Intro to Language and Linguistics class offered here at Biola in the Master's in TESOL program. So if you think back to that course, language is built on meaningful units, and beginning with phonology and then morphology and up to the syntax level. Language is built on these small spoken segments, so listeners have to identify what is the meaning of all these segments, and all the little hesitations and pauses that we say, and that I frequently use myself. Listeners have to learn how to interpret these segments. And there's information included in listening units. We use emphasis, we use prominence, we speak loudly, we speak with tone, and listeners need to learn how to interpret this information. So as we know, English is based on words and morphology, so listeners need to be able to identify those individual words in a sentence in spoken language. And this is different from doing it in reading with the written form, where you can look at the words, see the periods, see the spaces between the words, and then you know where a word begins and a word ends. But in the spoken language, we string together words, and each of us has our own tone and our own pace when we are speaking. And even as individuals, we have differing paces. And so, for example, myself, I use different paces, different tones when I'm speaking in different scenarios with different people, giving a presentation versus speaking in front of a group of second language learners. So as we learn to listen well, we have to be able to identify the different parts of speech and the different components of language. So this is explored in chapter 2, and Rost identifies it as linguistic bottom-up processing, which occurs in the human brain, and which humans need to be able to identify. And he calls it phonotactic units of language. And then, as you probably know, there's the native listener hypothesis, which shows that we learn our first language, and our first language plays a strong role. So we need a high amount of quality second language input in order to acquire the phonological processing and syntactic processing to make up listening skills. And here I'll go ahead and jump ahead to chapter 5, which is a discussion of computers and automated processing. And it's interesting that computers, much like the human brain, need to be able to interpret sounds through what they hear. And Rost describes this concept as natural language processing, which is the use of computers to process written and spoken language automatically for some practical and useful purpose. So, for example, nowadays we have Google Translate, and we have applications like Siri and Alexa and Google Voice and other voice recognition software. And this software has to be able to identify individual words, the pauses, the periods, the commas, the hesitations, the spoken words, where does one word begin, where does another word end. And this process is quite challenging, but it's what our human brains do, our fascinating human brains. And it's what second language learners have to do in a second language, and that's what's challenging. So Rost describes bottom-up processing, and then he also covers top-down processing. So chapters 3 and 4 cover semantic processing and pragmatic processing. And Rost points out that the first order goal of listening, according to many, is comprehension. So there's a question, how do we achieve comprehension? And we discern meaning through our background knowledge, our understanding of language structures, our schemata, and our shared social understanding, and an ability to find common ground. So when you're engaged in a conversation with another person, or you're listening to a speech, or any type of listening activity, you are listening and you're trying to find what can I relate to in this conversation that I'm having, or in the speech that I am listening to. And then given that, we use our shared frameworks and we find our common ground, and we use inference and integrate what we hear with problem solving and reasoning. We use deductive and inductive reasoning, and use compensatory strategies that help us make sense of what we hear. So even if you don't hear everything and you don't understand everything that you hear, you guess and you put together in your mind the ideas that the other person is saying, so you can make sense of it all. So even if you misunderstand part of what you hear, you can understand the whole as well, or you can ask questions to clarify meaning if you're interacting with a person, or figure it out in your brain. So those are skills that are involved in listening, and we need to teach our second language learners how to develop strategies and how to develop language listening skills so that they can do these processes on their own. And Rost ends section 1 with an overview of the role of listening in language acquisition. He has a quick overview of linguistic processing and lexical acquisition and semantic processing and pragmatic processing in a first language and your native language, and then also in the second language. And he notes multiple similarities between the two. And he also mentions that there are multiple challenges in second language acquisition, and the differences have more to do with the way that people approach their second language acquisition, their motivation, the time and effort that's necessary, that's required, and the cognitive and affective quality of their acquisition. So obviously there's a heavy cognitive load, and we need to do what we can to present learning opportunities to our students as we teach them how to listen and give them lots of input. So that's the end of section 1, and the next section will be on section 2, which is on teaching listening.